The true extent of the Inquisition's brutality. Thousands of Soviets exiled to a freezing cold island with no food or shelter, and a top-secret government project aiming to control people's minds. These are dark ancient facts schools refused to teach you. We've all heard the story, right? Pilgrims arrive at Plymouth Rock in 1620, starving and struggling through their first winter. The Native Americans come to their rescue, sharing food and teaching them how to plant crops. The following fall, they celebrate with a big feast, grateful for their new friends, but that story skips over the very grim reality. 3 years before the Pilgrims even showed up, European settlers and fishermen brought a deadly plague to the coastal tribes of what is now New England. This outbreak wiped out nearly 96% of the population. Entire villages were left empty with the bodies of the dead scattered across the land. In fact, one report from the time described seeing villages strewn with the skulls and bones of thousands, with no one left to bury them. The Pilgrims knew about this. They chose Cape Cod because they knew the land was already cleared, with cornfields left untouched by the deadly plague. And while the last Native Americans were struggling to survive, the Pilgrims would take advantage, stealing food and tools from those who were too weak to fight back. So that Thanksgiving story so many of us grew up with being told in school, it's missing a lot of the darker details. Most people know about the Spanish Inquisition, but what some don't realize is that the Inquisition went far beyond Spain. It spread across Europe and was just as brutal, if not worse, in places like Italy, France, and parts of Germany. The goal was to root out heretics, people who didn't follow the Catholic faith exactly as the church demanded. Anyone could be accused, and the punishment for being accused was brutal. And it was more than just a religious movement, it was a political tool. If you were a political rival, getting you labeled a heretic was a fast way to silence you. People were tormented until they confessed to crimes they didn't even commit. And exactly what were some of these methods of torment? Well, YouTube guidelines make it pretty tough to discuss in detail, but here are a few things I can say. You had people being burned alive, bones would be broken in the most intentionally painful way possible. There are also cases of people being buried alive. Now, the Inquisition did have a trial system, but there was no real defense. You're basically just guilty until proven guilty. And here's the thing, the Inquisition didn't even stop at Europe. It reached the Spanish colonies in the Americas, where it was used on indigenous populations as well. We all know about the French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille, the guillotine, all that, but what we don't usually hear about are the mass graves. Why so many mass graves though? Was it just the violence of the revolution? Well, partly, but it also more specifically involved a lot of people being executed. And no, we're not just talking about the famous beheadings of the aristocrats, we're talking about regular people who were accused of being enemies of the revolution or counter-revolutionaries. There was so much fear and paranoia at the time, with everyone constantly accusing each other of being a traitor, which led to thousands being executed without trial or any real proof of wrongdoing. Some estimates put the death toll in the tens of thousands, and most of them didn't get a proper burial. They'd be thrown into these mass graves unmarked, unceremonious. One of the largest mass graves was discovered beneath the Place de la Concorde, where they found the remains of thousands of people who'd just been piled together in pits. In 1933, about 6,700 people were sent to Nazino Island, a desolate patch of land in Siberia, by the Soviet government. These people were prisoners and people that the government just deemed undesirable for whatever reason. They're enemies of the state, if you will. They'd be promised work to help build a special settlement, but what they ended up getting was nothing short of a nightmare. No tools, no shelter, barely any food, and most certainly no help from the government. It was an absolute death trap. Within weeks, the situation spiraled out of control. People were starving, sick, and fighting for survival. There was no structure, no system in place to keep people alive. And as the weeks went on, the numbers started to drop drastically. Disease, violence, and starvation took out thousands of these folks, and those who tried to escape would be met with bullets from armed guards. Probably the most disturbing part of this whole situation, though, was what people started resorting to. There was so little to eat that people started eating each other. Within just 3 months, over 4,000 of these 6,700 deportees were dead or had disappeared. Their survivors, barely hanging on, were in terrible health, and the whole thing was successfully swept under the rug for decades. It wasn't until 1988 that the truth finally started coming out. In the early 50s, the CIA started something called Project Artichoke. The aim was to see if they could control someone's mind, turn people into mindless robots that would blindly follow orders, no matter how crazy or dangerous. The project started with a memo in 1952 that laid out the goal. Could they get someone to do their bidding, even if it meant breaking fundamental laws of nature, like self-preservation even? To find out, they ran these tests in secret locations all over the world. They had some in Europe, Japan, Southeast Asia, and the Philippines. The people they used in these experiments were often totally unaware that they were being tested on and were dosed with hallucinogens for days on end. Some were kept in isolation for so long, they even started losing their grip on reality. Alright, let's talk about Necropants. This is some seriously weird and disturbing Icelandic history for you. Basically, Necropants were these magical pants made from the skin of a dead person's legs. No, they probably weren't actually magical, but they were made from dead people's legs. I've seen images. I don't suggest looking it up. In order to get these pants, you had to make a pact with a friend that if one of you died, the other could harvest the legs to make these pants. So they'd dig up your body, they'd skin your legs, and use the skin to craft a pair of pants. The pants didn't actually work until you did something really specific though. You had to steal a coin from a poor widow. Then you'd place the coin in the natural pouch area of these pants, providing they were from a male's legs. You know, the skin pocket, right in the middle of the legs. Once the coin was in, these magic pants were said to bring tremendous wealth to the wearer. On October 24th, 1871, a mob of around 500 men stormed Chinatown in Los Angeles. They killed at least 20 Chinese Americans and looted the place, taking around $1.5 million worth of property. This all started because of a shootout that had happened earlier that day, where a police officer named Robert Thompson was killed. When the news spread, rumors started flying that the Chinese were somehow responsible, and that was all it took. Chaos ensued, and people took matters into their own hands by targeting the entire community. And this massacre was just the beginning of this barrage of violence against Chinese and other Asian American communities across the states. It led to laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act, passed just a few years later, which banned all Chinese laborers from immigrating to the US. Roller coasters, the adrenaline-pumping rides that we all love. I guess we can't really say everyone, actually, but a good amount of us. At the very least, we all know a roller coaster when we see one, but are we all aware of the strange origin of the ride? Well, back in the 1880s, a businessman named Lamarcus Thompson was frustrated and appalled by how Americans were spending their free time, having way too much fun in places like saloons and brothels, or even saloons with brothels in them. He was fed up with it and thought there had to be a way to get people to enjoy themselves without disappointing God. So Thompson began spitballing a brand new idea. Why not build something that gives people a rush, but without all the drinking and premarital coitus? Thus came the roller coaster. He took his idea to Coney Island, New York, which at the time was basically the hotbed for everything Thompson thought was wrong with the world. It was here that the very first roller coaster was erected, the Gravity Switchback Railway, which opened on June 13th, 1884. During World War I, a group of Native American soldiers played a big role in the Allies' success, mainly because of their language. German troops were excellent at intercepting and cracking codes, which gave them an edge. But in 1918, a group of Choctaw soldiers was brought in to use their native language as a code, and it worked. The Germans didn't understand it, so the Choctaw soldiers were able to relay important information without the enemy being able to intercept them. During World War II, the US specifically recruited Native American soldiers for the same purpose. The Navajo, in particular, developed a code with over 600 terms. It was so effective that it remained unbroken throughout the war. Now, this piece of history certainly isn't dark itself. It's pretty cool, but it is very unfortunate fact that it's left out of so many school curriculums. At least when I was a kid, I never learned about this. The Priests of Amun were a secretive group in ancient Egypt who held an incredible amount of power. Amun was one of the most important gods in Egypt, and the priests who served him gained control of massive wealth. At their peak, they were so powerful they could rival the pharaohs themselves. What made them so powerful was their control over Egypt's resources. The priests managed the grain trade, meaning they basically controlled food access for the entire population. If a pharaoh didn't cooperate with them, he could be pushed out of power. During the reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten, for example, they overthrew him when he tried to shift Egypt's focus from Amun to the sun god Aten. By this time, the priests had enough influence to decide who would rule Egypt, and sometimes that meant removing the pharaoh. So with all that said, I've been your host James. I will catch you, yes you specifically, in the next video.